Yeah, I think it's funny.
Archaeology here at the Jimenez Facio House actually began in the early 1970s. The colonial dames were beginning a large project of restoration and renovation, and they wanted all the details to be right.
This is the most dug property in St. Augustine. I think there's various reasons why it's the most intensively excavated property. First of all, it's the colonial dames' interest in understanding the history of their property.
And that, of course, is always an incentive for archaeologists to work on a site when there's funding and an open welcome.
Another reason is you have the dedication of the University of Florida researchers, archaeologists, who've used this as a base for field schools to train young budding archaeologists over the past few decades. And finally, this is within the oldest part of town, and it's really one of the largest lots. You actually have space in which to open up the ground areas.
When I was teaching at Florida State University, I was teaching an annual field school here in St. Augustine, and again the colonial dames were continuing their project, but I don't think people would have continued working and kind of stuck around here had it not been for the richness of this property. There's occupation going back to the 16th century, to the founding of St. Augustine, and so it's possible to really look at the whole spectrum of St. Augustine's occupation here.
We assume certain things based on the existing street layout that we see today. The question is, does that street layout correspond to what was here 400 years ago? And to answer that question, you have to go into the archaeological record. The Jimenez Facio has been very important because it's one of the few properties that we've had access to where we can actually uncover 16th century deposits that can tell us about the layout.
Well, we have recovered information that tells the story of the site since it was first occupied, and there were a number of different occupations of this property.
You know, the earliest dates to the late 1500s when we found a well behind what is now the kitchen area. Believe it or not, one of the things that is interesting is that St. Augustine had trash collection going on in the late 1800s. All right, they were actually, they were called scavengers. And people would put their trash along the roadside and the scavengers would come and pick it up. But what we also find is that people still follow the old ways, and that is burying their trash in their backyard.
And for archaeologists, garbage is the best thing we can find. We often think of the National Enquirer when it used to send people to steal Elvis's garbage and things like that, because that garbage would tell stories that you might not otherwise hear.
We uncovered a trash pit that dates to the late 1600s, and found within that trash pit was this beautiful artifact known as the Caravaca cross. And that cross, you know, represented a religious symbol that somebody owned back over 300 years ago. Boy, when you get into those early colonial deposits, that really gets the juices flowing. St. Augustine moved 3 separate times within the first 7 years of its existence. The first settlement was at today's Fountain of Youth Park, and that was settled in September 1565, only lasted 9 months, and then they moved it to a location on Anastasia Island. Now, we don't know exactly where on Anastasia Island, but we do know it was somewhere along the coast, because documents say that one of the reasons why they moved back to the mainland after 6 years on the island was because the wave tidal actions were starting to erode the fort. And so therefore they decided to move back here. Now, one of the factors for that decision was either the pacification of the Native American population or the decimation of the Native American population. When the Spanish came, they brought pandemic diseases, and it killed off a lot of the Native Americans within the first few years of the Spanish settlement. So where the downtown area is today, a little section of the downtown area, that is the original downtown settlement that was established in 1572. And where the Jimenez Facio site is right by the epicenter. Averly Street is the oldest documented street of European origin in America. The Church of Los Remedios, which was the first parish church here in St. Augustine, is located right down there at the corner of King and Averly Street. It's underneath the Heritage House right now. And so Averly Street was just a natural corridor leading from the residential area to the back of the church.
One of the things that we can infer about this property from the 16th century onward is that it was usually or almost always occupied by people of economic means, high status people in the community. And we infer that because it's very close to the plaza, which is where the most desirable lots were and the most elite people usually lived, but also because of the kinds of artifacts that have been found here. Imported ceramics, perfume bottles, and parts of ornaments. So the archaeological record from each of these time periods suggests that it was always a high status place.
When you look at all the scholarly work that's been produced here in St. Augustine, it's primarily focused on the colonial period. We haven't really focused on the territorial period or early statehood periods to any great extent. I love this property because the Jimenez Facio site really interprets one point of time, and that's a period that does not receive the attention it should.
Well, one of the unique things about this property is its role in Florida tourism, and most people think that, of course, tourism began in Florida and St. Augustine with Henry Flagler. And we were surprised when we started really looking at the history of the site and talking to the colonial dames at the tourist function of this house is much earlier than we usually associate any kind of tourism in Florida. We felt like we were working on Florida's first tourist place. One of the most interesting collaborations we've had with the colonial dames, archaeologists and interpreters, is being able to reconstruct details of life to interpret to visitors who come visit the site. We've been able to find the actual food remains and so able to show what would have been served at the tables. And also what plates and platters and bowls were used to present to the guests. And the colonial dames have been very thorough in tracking down whole examples of the kinds of pottery that we found from that period and reproducing it in the house. And I think it also helps visitors to understand what it was like to live without our modern conveniences when they visit sites like this. You can see in this kitchen having to work on an open fire, hanging kettles over it to boil water in the summer must have been really uncomfortable. And many of the kinds of things that were used every day then are completely unfamiliar to visitors today. This hollow pottery bullet-shaped object that molten sugar, the wet boiled sugar, was poured into, and then it crystallized and dried. And if they could get it out of the pot without breaking it, and it would be shipped that way. Many were shipped in the molds, and then the molds could be reused to cover up a cone of sugar. So the cones of sugar actually came from this shape that was used from the 16th century onward. The kitchen at the Jimenez Facio site is unique. In most places that had detached kitchens, they were ephemeral, and they really didn't persist. But we've found architecturally and archaeologically that this building is on colonial foundations, and it has been maintained and preserved by not only the people who lived here, but then the people who owned it over the years. The oven is the only one I know of really from that early time, the bake oven. And this, probably more than anything, communicates to visitors the reality of living in St. Augustine during the 19th century. Detached kitchens also give visitors a chance to think more about hazards of fire and why there should be and almost had to be a detached kitchen.
There's a variety of reasons why we decided to return to this property, and when we worked out this arrangement with the Colonial Dames to come in and do this excavation as part of the 450th celebration, we wanted to look at an area that we thought had never really been examined. And that's why it's really exciting to be working here, because the possibility exists that we will uncover 16th century deposits. And for me, you know, having spent 25 years working in St. Augustine, it's really the early stuff I find that's really exciting, because we just don't know a lot about it. Archaeologists are storytellers as well as scientists.
All right, this was all mid-1700s right through here. You know, this is pretty early. I would say it has not seen the light of day for well over 350 years.
Archaeology, in its essence, is uncovering what has been buried for decades, centuries, millennia, and bringing it to life.